A tray of tin cups crashed against the stone floor. The sound cracked through the great hall like a gunshot, and every head turned. A woman dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather them, her hands shaking so hard the metal kept slipping from her fingers. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. Her vision swam. Black spots crowded the edges of her sight. She gripped the table leg and forced herself upright, swaying, biting down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. Nobody helped her. Nobody moved. In a kingdom at war, a starving nurse was not worth a single glance. But one man was watching. From the high table, the Alpha King had not looked away once. Her name was Della Whitcomb, and she was about to steal one bite of food from a king's plate. What happened next would change everything. Stay with me now. The great hall of Ashbourne Hollow belonged to the wounded now. It had once been a place for feasts and treaties, but the war in the low valleys had changed that. Rows of cots lined the floor where long tables used to stand. Men groaned in their sleep. The air was thick with the smell of tallow smoke and old blood, and Della moved through all of it without stopping, because stopping was the one thing she could not afford to do. She was the last field nurse still standing at the lodge. The others had been sent down the mountain to the front, or they had simply left, walking off into the cold rather than watch more boys die on straw. Della stayed. She didn't have anywhere else to go, and she wasn't the kind to walk out on a room full of people who needed her. So she wrapped wounds and set bones and held hands until the shaking stopped, and she did it on an empty stomach. Here's the thing about wartime rationing. It doesn't fall evenly. The soldiers who could still fight got fed first. The wounded got what was left, and the ones who tended the wounded got whatever was left after that, which most days was nothing at all. Della had given her last 3 portions to a boy named Thomas with a shattered leg, because he was 17 and crying for his mother, and a full belly was the only comfort she had to offer him. She told herself she'd eat tomorrow. She'd been telling herself that for 3 days. Now here's where I need you to understand something about this woman. She was thin. Her cheekbones stood out sharp under her skin, and her wrists had gone to bird bones, and there were dark hollows under her eyes that no amount of sleep would fix. But she carried herself straight, chin up, shoulders back. She wore her pride like a coat 2 sizes too big, and she pulled it tight around herself, and she did not let anyone see her fall apart. Not once. She wasn't alone either. A dog followed her everywhere. A wolfhound, though you'd never guess it from the state of him. His ribs showed through his gray coat like the slats of a fence. Somebody had named him Biscuit, probably as a joke, because there wasn't a biscuit to be had for 100 miles. He'd attached himself to Della 3 weeks back when she'd shared a crust with him, and he never left her side after that. Where she went, he went. When she knelt by a cot, he lay down beside her. He was starving too. They were a matched pair, the thin nurse and the thin dog, and between them they had exactly nothing. That evening the royal party arrived at the lodge. Word came up the road ahead of them. The Alpha King himself, riding through on his way to inspect the eastern lines, would shelter at Ashbourne Hollow for a single night. The staff went into a quiet panic. What little food remained in the stores was hauled out and cooked, and the high table at the end of the hall was cleared and set. And for the first time in weeks, the smell of roasted meat and hot bread rolled through that room full of hungry men. Della felt it in her knees. The smell hit her like a hand pressing on her chest, and her stomach turned over so hard she had to stop and hold the wall. She looked down the hall at the high table, at the platters being carried in, and she made herself look away. That food was not for her. She knew exactly what she was, and it was not the kind of person who ate at a king's table. Then he came in. Roman Vasquez, Alpha King of the Mountain Kingdoms, did not look the way she expected a king to look. He was tall and built heavy through the shoulders the way a fighting man is built, with a thick neck and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in days. He walked like he was ready for something. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the cots, the wounded, the blood on the straw, and something in his face tightened. He did not smile. He sat at the high table and the food was laid before him, plate after plate, more food than Della had seen in a year. And he didn't eat. That was the strange part. He sat there with a feast in front of him and his hands flat on the table, and he watched the room. He watched the wounded men. And though Della didn't know it yet, he watched her. From the moment she'd carried a basin across the floor and set it down without spilling a drop despite hands that would not stop trembling. From the moment the tray of cups crashed and she pulled herself upright rather than stay down. He watched all of it, and he said nothing. Della had one job left before she could rest. Clear the empty cups from the far end of the hall, the ones near the high table, and carry them to the wash. She didn't want to go near that food. She knew what it would do to her. But the cups had to be cleared, so she squared her shoulders and she walked toward the king's table with Biscuit padding along at her heel, and she told herself she would keep her eyes down and get it done. That was the plan. It did not survive. The king's plate sat at the corner of the high table, closest to where the empty cups had been stacked, and it was untouched. Whole and full and untouched, the meat still steaming, and there, right at the edge, a single roasted potato had rolled slightly apart from the rest, golden and crisp and glistening with fat. Della stacked the cups. She kept her eyes down the way she'd promised herself. But her body had its own ideas now, 3 days deep into hunger, and her gaze dragged sideways to that potato and would not let go. She was so hungry she could hear her own heartbeat. 1 potato. From a plate the king wasn't even eating. From a feast so large it would be scraped into the pig bucket before morning, because that was what happened to a king's leftovers. Nobody was looking. Everyone was busy. It would not be missed. It would not matter to a single soul in the world. And she was going to faint if she didn't put something in her stomach, and then who would tend the wounded in the night? She told herself all of that. And she knew, even as she told it, that none of it was really the reason. The reason was simpler and older than reason. She was starving and there was food, and she was still barely an animal that wanted to live. Her hand moved. Quick, low, close to the table's edge. Her fingers closed around the potato. It was still warm, and the warmth of it went straight up her arm and into her chest like something holy. She palmed it against her apron and stepped back and turned, and her heart was slamming so hard she thought the whole hall must be able to hear it. Nobody shouted. No guard grabbed her. She'd done it. She'd gotten away with it. She slipped into the shadow of a stone pillar out of the light, and she let herself breathe. Biscuit pressed against her leg, his nose already working, his tail giving one slow, hopeful sweep. And Della looked down at the potato in her cupped hands, this stolen thing, this small, warm miracle, and her eyes stung. Then she broke it in half. She didn't even think about it. It was the most natural thing in the world to her. She broke the potato in 2 and held the larger half down to the starving dog, who took it so gently from her fingers that his teeth never touched her skin. And she ate her own half slow, one small bite at a time, standing in the shadow of a pillar, sharing a stolen potato with a stray. For a moment the hunger loosened its grip. For a moment she wasn't afraid. She thought, that's the end of it. Nobody saw, it's over. She was wrong on the last part. Somebody had seen every second of it. A chair scraped against stone at the high table. The sound was small, but in a hall gone quiet it carried, and Della's head came up. The Alpha King had risen to his feet. He stood there a moment, looking down the length of the room, and then he stepped off the dais and started walking, straight down the center of the hall, straight toward the pillar where she stood with crumbs on her lips and a dog at her feet. Everyone saw it now. The whole room went still. Nurses froze mid-step. A guard's hand drifted toward his belt. And Della felt the blood drain out of her face as she understood all at once that he was not walking toward the wounded or the door or anything else. He was walking toward her. She'd stolen from a king, and the king was coming. Her first thought was Biscuit, not herself. She stepped in front of the dog, putting her thin body between him and the man crossing the floor, because if someone was going to be punished for a stolen potato, it was going to be her and not a starving animal. She lifted her chin. She met his eyes as he came, because if you're going to go down, you go down looking straight ahead, and that was the only kind of pride she had left. Roman Vasquez stopped in front of her. Up close he was even bigger, and she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. She waited for the accusation. She waited for the guards. She had her confession ready on her tongue, all of it. It was me, only me, the dog did nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes went from her face to her trembling hands to the crumbs on her fingers to the dog behind her legs. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, and it was not what she was braced for at all. "You broke it in half," he said. Della didn't understand. She stared at him. "You were starving," he said. "Anyone in this room could see it. You had one bite of food in 3 days. And you gave half of it to the dog." He shook his head slowly, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. "I've watched men who had everything share nothing, and I just watched a woman who had nothing share half." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "What's your name?" he asked. "Della," she managed. "Della Whitcomb. Your Majesty, I took the potato, it was me. The dog had nothing to do with." "Stop," he said it gently, but it stopped her cold. "You're not in trouble. Sit down before you fall down. That's an order, and it's the only one I'll give you tonight." He pulled a bench out from the wall with one hand as if it weighed nothing, and he made her sit. And then the Alpha King of the Mountain Kingdoms did a thing that no one in that hall would ever forget. He walked back to the high table and he picked up his own untouched plate, the whole feast of it, and he carried it down the length of the room, and he set it on the bench beside her. Meat, bread, the rest of the potatoes, all of it. Steam rising off the top. "Eat," he said, "slowly, small bites or you'll be sick. There's plenty. If you're still with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what this king did next is the part nobody at that table saw coming, and I don't want you to miss it." Della looked at the plate. She looked at him. And then, because she was Della, she said, "The men are hungry too, all of them. I can't eat this in front of them." For the first time, Roman Vasquez smiled. It was small and it was tired, but it was real. "No," he agreed. "You can't, and you won't have to." He turned to the frozen hall and raised his voice, and it filled the room the way it was built to. "Open the stores, all of it. Every barrel, every sack, every ounce of grain we brought up that road tonight. I want every wounded man in this hall fed before I sleep, and every nurse, and anyone else in this building whose ribs I can count. Move." The hall exploded into motion, and that should have been the end of the story, the kind king and the grateful nurse and a feast for the wounded. That's how these stories are supposed to go. But it wasn't the end. Because there was a reason Roman Vasquez had not looked away from Della Whitcomb all night, and it had nothing to do with a potato, and everything to do with a name he thought he'd never hear again. He waited until she'd eaten. He watched her put color back into her cheeks one careful bite at a time, watched her sneak half of every mouthful down to the dog even now, and he waited. Then, when the hall was loud with the clatter of the stores being opened, he sat down on the bench across from her, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Whitcomb, your father wasn't a man named Aldous Whitcomb by any chance, a physician from the Eastern Reach." Della's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "He was," she said slowly. "He died when I was young. How could you possibly?" "Because he saved my life," Roman said. "When I was 9 years old and burning up with the wasting fever, and every other healer in the kingdom had already told my father to prepare for my funeral, Aldous Whitcomb rode 3 days through a blizzard to reach me. He didn't leave my side for a week. And when I lived, He refused every reward my father tried to give him. He looked at her, and his jaw was tight. He said the only thanks he wanted was that I'd remember there are people in this kingdom who go without, and that a king who forgets them doesn't deserve the crown. The trigger when it came was a single sound. From the far end of the hall where the great doors stood came the ring of steel being drawn, not one blade, several, and a voice that did not belong to any nurse or wounded man called out, flat and cold, cutting through the noise of the feast. Nobody move. By order of Lord Castellan, this lodge is under seizure. The whole nature of the night changed in that instant. It was no longer a story about a hungry woman and a kind king. 6 men had come through the doors, armed and armored, and they were not the king's men. They wore the gray and black of the Castellan, the king's own regent, the man Roman had left to hold the Low Country while he rode east. And that man, it turned out, had not been holding it for Roman at all. Roman was on his feet before the echo died, and the change in him was total. The tired man who'd carried a plate across a room was gone. In his place stood something that made the armed men slow at the door. But there were 6 of them, and more behind, and Roman had ridden up the mountain with a small escort, most of whom were bedded down in the stables below. He'd walked into this hall unarmed, a king among his own wounded, and someone had counted on exactly that. Castellan's declared himself, the lead soldier said, advancing. The war's a sham. He's been feeding the front to the enemy for a year to bleed the crown dry. And you rode straight into his hands, Vasquez. All we had to do was wait for you to stop somewhere quiet. He smiled. A lodge full of cripples couldn't ask for quieter. Now here's where it turned, and I want you to see it clearly, because the man had made one mistake. He thought a hall full of wounded soldiers and starving nurses was a hall full of people who couldn't fight. He looked at Della and the men on the cots, and he saw weakness. He did not understand what a king had just done in that room and what it had bought him. Roman raised his empty hands slow. There are wounded men here, he said. Sick men. Let me move them out first and I'll go with you. No blood. No, said the soldier. No witnesses, that's the whole point. No witnesses. There it was. It wasn't about capturing a king anymore. It was about making sure no one walked out of that lodge alive to say what they'd seen. The men on the cots, the nurses, Della, Biscuit, all of them gone, and a fire to hide the rest, and a story told down the mountain about how the Alpha King had died in a tragic accident far from home. Della understood it in the same breath he did. And she did not freeze. She'd spent 3 years in that lodge. She knew every inch of it. She knew the stores had just been thrown open, which meant the cellar doors were unbarred and the tunnel beneath them. The old escape run cut into the mountain when the lodge was first built, stood open for the first time in months. She knew the wounded men, every one of them, and she knew that half of them had asked her 100 times for a chance to be more than a body on a cot. And she knew something the Castellan's men did not, which was that a soldier with a broken leg still has 2 good hands. She stood up, slow. And she stepped again in front of the dog, and then a little further, until she stood between the armed men and the king. You want no witnesses, she said, and her voice carried further than she expected, thin but steady. Then you'd best be quick, because this whole hall just watched their king empty his own plate to feed them, every man here. You want to kill 60 witnesses before one of them reaches a window and screams it down the mountain. The lead soldier's eyes flicked just for a second to the cots, and in that second the room moved. It didn't happen the way a battle happens in songs. It happened the way desperate things happen. A wounded man nearest the door, a big sergeant with a bandaged shoulder, swung the heavy iron cook pot he'd been eating from and caught the nearest soldier across the helmet with a sound like a bell. 2 nurses upended a cot into the legs of another. Biscuit, that starving gray ghost of a dog, came off the floor snarling and locked his jaws on a swordsman's forearm. And Roman Vasquez, freed for one heartbeat by the chaos, crossed the space between himself and the lead soldier in 2 strides and took him off his feet. I won't pretend it was even. Roman was one man, unarmed. But he'd been raised to this, and a lifetime of it came out of him at once. He drove the lead soldier into the stone floor and came up with the man's own sword, and after that the shape of things changed fast. The Castellan's men had planned for a slaughter. They had not planned for a fight. They had not counted on 60 people with nothing left to lose and one reason left to fight for, and that reason was standing in the middle of the hall with a stolen sword and a torn coat, roaring at them to get down. Della didn't fight. She did the thing she was made for. She grabbed the boy Thomas by his good arm and dragged his cot toward the cellar door, and she shouted for the others to follow, and she made a lane through the chaos and started moving the helpless out of it. 2 down the cellar steps. 4. She counted them the way she counted everything, refusing to leave one behind, going back into the noise each time even as steel rang behind her. One of the soldiers broke free of Roman and saw what she was doing, saw the wounded escaping into the tunnel, and he went for her with his blade up. She heard the step behind her and she turned, and there was nothing in her hands but a rolled bandage and a boy's weight on her shoulder, and for one long second she looked death in the face. Roman got there first. He always would have. He put himself between the blade and the nurse the way she'd put herself between the king and the dog, and the sword meant for her opened a long red line across his side instead. He grunted and staggered and did not fall. He took the soldier's wrist and broke it and put him on the ground, and then he had one hand pressed to his own ribs and blood coming through his fingers. And then, as fast as it had begun, it was over. The Castellan's men were down, or fled back through the doors into the arms of Roman's escort, who had heard the noise and come pounding up from the stables at last. The hall was a wreck of overturned cots and groaning men, but it was theirs. They'd held it. 60 starving, wounded, forgotten people had held a king's lodge against armed killers, and every one of the wounded Della had moved was safe in the tunnel below, counted and accounted for. Roman sank down onto a bench, one hand clamped to his side, his face gone gray. And Della, without a thought for his crown or her place or anything else, was on her knees in front of him in an instant, tearing his shirt open, pressing clean linen to the wound, her hands as steady now as they had been shaking before. The starving nurse who could barely stand an hour ago was the calmest person in the room. "Hold still," she told the Alpha King. "You've done enough tonight. This part's mine." He looked down at her, at this thin woman stitching him back together on the floor of a ruined hall, and he almost laughed, and it turned into a hiss of pain instead. "Your father," he said through his teeth, "would have said something exactly like that." "My father," Della said, threading the needle without looking up, "would have told you that a king who walks into a lodge full of the poor and unarmed and feeds them before he feeds himself is a fool who's going to get himself killed one day." She tied off the stitch. "And then he'd have said it was the only kind of king worth having. Hold still." The wound was long but not deep. She closed it. And when it was done, she sat back on her heels, and the whole weight of the night came down on her at once, and she was suddenly aware that she was kneeling in front of the most powerful man in the kingdom with his blood on her hands, and she didn't know what came next. What came next was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after when the shouting is done and everyone is still breathing hard and counting themselves lucky. The wounded came back up out of the tunnel. Someone got the fires built up. And the food, thank God, was still there, hauled out of the open stores. And for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the great hall of Ashbourne Hollow was full of the sound of people eating their fill. The Castellans' treason came apart over the following weeks, though Della only heard most of it later. Roman sent riders down the mountain that same night, and by the time the snow melted, the war that had starved them all was revealed for what it had been: a long, slow theft dressed up as a siege, and the man behind it answered for it. The front lines quieted. The rationing eased. Food came back up the mountain roads in carts instead of trickles, and the wounded at the lodge were the first to be fed, on the king's standing order which he never rescinded. But that's the kingdom's story. The one I want to leave you with is smaller. Roman stayed at the lodge while his wound healed, which took longer than it should have, and everyone, including his own physician, suspected he could have left a week before he did. He took his meals in the great hall, at a long table with the wounded, because he refused after that night to eat anywhere else. And every single time before he touched a bite, he found the thin nurse across the room and he waited until she sat down too. He never let her go hungry again. He never let anyone in that hall go hungry again, and he'd tell you if you asked that he'd learned how a man should eat from watching a starving woman break a potato in half. Della kept working. She'd have told you she didn't know how to do anything else, but she wasn't invisible anymore. The whole kingdom, it turned out, had heard the story by spring, the way stories travel, changed and grown in the telling but true at the heart of it. The nurse who stole one bite and shared it. The king who saw. And there was a locket in the end, though it wasn't the romantic kind you're imagining. It was her father's. Roman had it all these years, the small, worn locket Aldous Whitcomb had left behind at his bedside 20 years ago and that Roman had carried since. A physician's locket with a single word etched inside the case. Remember. He'd carried it up the mountain in his coat. That was the thing, the real reason he had not looked away from her all night. He'd seen her father's face in hers before he'd known her name. He gave it back to her on the last day before he rode down the mountain, pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers over it, and told her that her father had kept his promise all those years ago, and that tonight he'd finally understood what the man had meant. That there are people in every kingdom who go without, and that a crown that forgets them isn't worth the weight of it. Della opened her hand and looked at the little locket, and read the word inside, and understood at last that she'd been raised by a man who changed a king without ever meaning to. "Come down the mountain with me," Roman said. "Not as anyone's servant. The lodge can spare one nurse. My court can't. There are 10,000 people down there who have gone hungry this year, and I mean to see them fed, and I don't trust myself to remember it on my own. I need someone who breaks the potato in half without thinking. Come and keep me honest, Della Whitcomb." She looked at him a long moment. Then she looked down at Biscuit, who had filled out through the ribs by now, a proper wolfhound at last, and who thumped his tail against the stone as if he'd understood the whole thing. "He comes too," she said. "He comes too," Roman agreed. And that was how it ended, more or less. Not with a crown or a wedding, though those came later and quieter than any story would tell you. It ended with a thin nurse and a rangy dog riding down a mountain road beside a king, into a kingdom that was about to learn it had a queen who counted every hungry person the way she'd once counted every wounded man, refusing to leave a single one behind. She never forgot what it was to be the person nobody looked at. That was the whole of it in the end. The king had seen her when no one else would. And she spent the rest of her life making sure that in Ashbourne Hollow no starving soul ever went unseen again. Not one. Not ever. Remember that the next time you think a small kindness disappears into the dark. Sometimes there's a king across the room, watching the whole time. And sometimes the smallest thing you do, the thing you're sure nobody saw, is the thing that changes everything.